Greetings everyone, this is the director, and wouldn't you know it, Vikings Season 6 has finally released its final part, Season 6B, and to tell the truth, I was a little disappointed, though then again I kind of expected to be disappointed. Especially as this show is not only historically inaccurate, but the writing was just sloppy and terrible, and I feel that some of the things they have been building up to in the first half of Season 6 ended in very anticlimactic ways and had little to nothing to do whatsoever with the second half of Season 6, almost as if the first half was almost completely thrown out of the window, from which then they had so much potential and it seems to be squandered. Now, I know they had to go for some semi-historical angles in order for this show to be somewhat relevant. To tell the truth, I believe they could have done a much better job here, building off of what they had built up on the first half of Season 6, and they completely failed. Especially with the angles on which they were trying to go for, and I feel that they have failed to do so. It was extremely poor in how they handled the ending of Season 6B in Vikings, but not as bad as, say, Game of Thrones in their final season. But let me explain. So, if you have seen the series, then good for you. If you haven't seen this yet, or even seen the last episodes of Season 6B, then I'm warning you, spoiler alert, click away from this video. However, as you can see by this map here, the Kievan Rus lands, where modern-day Russia is, would make an invasion army to go all the way past Sweden, past Denmark, and up to Norway. Pretty much of an insane venture, and they decide to specifically attack Norway simply because that's where Ivar wants to have the invasion for Kattegat, from which then the supply lines would have been overextended. Not only did this invasion never take place, but it would have been pointless and downright a suicidal venture, which, ironically, it was. At first I thought this was poor thinking on behalf of the writers, but then again, I think the writers took into mind that this was a suicidal venture, and I'll explain. Now, as a matter of fact, I think that this was very poor writing for Oleg to take interest in the Scandinavian countries, and if he did, why not invade the closest one of Sweden first before going on to Norway, and then possibly Denmark? It would keep them from overextending their supply lines, otherwise they would have needed to plunder in order to live off the land and supply their large army, and despite the fact that they had such a large army, they're in the territory of their enemies, where the enemy could just raise up peasant militia, and many civilizations such as the Scandinavians and even the Saxons were able to raise up fyrds or peasant militia whenever the enemies were invading to give them a little extra manpower when facing an invading army. Ironically, lo and behold, that's exactly what Bjorn Ironsides does, as well as use the fact that they thought he died, only to reveal that he was still alive, to shatter the morale of the Kievan Rus, and then come up with a pincer movement of a large Norwegian army. Granted, this was a clever strategy on Bjorn's part, but to be fair, since they were building up to the Kievan Rus invasion for the first half of Season 6, this defeat of the Kievan Rus is so anticlimactic. But I would say they did do a good job on the part of Fitzurk, as Fitzurk eventually learns to be forgiving towards his brother Ivar for killing his fiancée, as well as forgiving and not holding a grudge towards Bjorn for banishing him. Now, I did not like Bjorn Ironsides as a character throughout the series, and Ivar I disliked even more. But I really liked the character development for Bjorn. Recognizing that he's made so many mistakes and deciding to give his life to make amends for them. But this feels like very poor writing that they build up the Rus invasion for half a season only to be repelled in one episode of the second half of the season, only to kill off one of the main characters. It seems like very poor, rushed writing, if you ask me. The Kievan Rus were technically Vikings who ended up settling among modern-day Russia, which is where we get the word Russia and the Russian people from in the first place. And the religion was the combination of Slavic paganism and Norse paganism, so it's very inaccurate at this particular time to be portraying them as Christians. But granted, Oleg does not behave like a genuine biblical Christian, especially when you see him at the execution of King Olaf, when he doesn't even recognize or find any deep spiritual significance with the words of King Olaf when he's being executed. And to tell the truth, I can appreciate that, showing him not to be a true biblical Christian, but only a nominal Christian, as in reality, the real Prince Oleg was actually a pagan.
What does he say?
He says, "He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. I am the resurrection and the life. I shall walk beside you. Always. Always."
Don't listen to him.
So I can actually appreciate the fact that though Oleg and the Kievan Rus are depicted as Christian, so to speak, he's only portrayed to be a nominal Christian here. Now, that scene was very meaningful to me from a historical perspective and from a Christian perspective, because I myself am a Christian, an AG Pentecostal Protestant, and so I could only assume that this was Jesus Christ giving King Olaf the message of accepting him just before he dies, and I found that scene quite beautiful. But as Prince Oleg is ironically knowledgeable in the Bible, and yet he shows no appreciation for the fact that his whole invasion is to end paganism, and yet he shows no sympathy or mercy for Olaf despite the fact that he's converted. It shows that he really only wants power, and thus is no true biblical Christian, also pertaining to the scripture of saying, "Not all who say, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven." But it also portrays Oleg as self-righteous, a lot like the Pharisees and Sadducees in how they were with Jesus. And for him not being portrayed as a true biblical Christian, in a way that gives a sense of a better historical accuracy with Prince Oleg, as in reality Prince Oleg was a pagan and would have had the morality of a pagan. So I guess you could say, in a complicated, certain kind of way, that was a bit of a historical inaccuracy, but for those who do not understand Christianity or Christian morality, they should have at least portrayed Prince Oleg as a pagan in order to be more historically accurate, and to actually portray him as a Viking. And why plunder the poorer areas of Scandinavia when they wouldn't match the wealth of the more southern kingdoms and realms such as the Byzantine Empire, from which the Kievan Rus did raid the Byzantine Empire in real life, which they show Prince Oleg is about to do, but before he can raid the Byzantine Empire, as he did in real life, this happens.
I'm sorry.
And in this, Ivar takes Igor to Novgorod in order to amass an army, but there is no final battle to overthrow Oleg, but Kiev just surrenders instantly, and then Oleg is left powerless, which is so anticlimactic. What would have been better would show Prince Oleg going off to raid Constantinople, as he officially did in real life, fails at Constantinople, comes back with a much weakened army, and then has no choice but to surrender. Then Igor would take Oleg's life. That is how they could have done things better, with a slightly more historically accurate storyline and a more well-written, developed storyline. But this just makes no sense. Besides, if Prince Oleg's reign was so weak over the people of Kiev, why go to Novgorod at all? This seems to be so anticlimactic and such a waste of time, as if the journey to Novgorod and then all the way back down to the lands of Kiev were a total waste, only to fulfill screen time for longer episodes. And then after which Ivar leaves and goes back to Kattegat, and then the people of Kattegat and King Harold accept him back as if nothing ever happens, especially in a warrior society where the smallest of wrongs are probably settled by ritual combat. This makes no sense from a cultural standpoint, especially when trust needs to be rebuilt and earned. Now, in this series, although this did not happen in real life, Ivar had established himself as the ruler of Kattegat, and being the ruler of Kattegat, he was an executive tyrant. And then after he is ousted by his brothers Fitzurk and Bjorn Ironsides, he flees to the lands of the Kievan Rus, and that's where he gets the army, and thus invades Norway, almost coming to the point where he retakes Kattegat. And now they suddenly accept him back, despite these 2 times he has wronged them. When from a cultural standpoint, in a warrior society, this makes no sense. For King Harold, it makes perfect sense, as he was technically a flip-flopper. One moment he was on the side of Ivar the Boneless in the Kattegat Civil War, which ironically resembles Norway's Civil War in how he establishes himself as king of all Norway in real life, and not by election, as was shown in the series. And then he ends up flipping to support Bjorn Ironside when it is in his best interest to overthrow Ivar. And so Harold politically only cares for himself at this point, and only affection he seems to show towards others are his next of kin and family, being his original first wife in the series, Astrid, and also being his brother Halfdan, which ironically he was pretty disappointed and sorrowful as he had to kill him, as Halfdan had supported Bjorn in the Kattegat Civil War. But it makes sense that he would flip-flop. But for the rest of Kattegat to accept him just makes no sense. And by the way, I have no problem with a town or a group of people accepting somebody back who was a former aggressor upon them in the past. But other series in the past, and even more recently, have done a scenario where a former aggressor is accepted back as a friend and ally. In the past, the How to Train Your Dragon series did it well, especially as they had no choice, because then Stoic the Vast and Hiccup Haddock had to accept Alvin the Treacherous as an ally because Dagger the Deranged of the Berserker tribe was a more prominent threat.
All right. Let's say we accept this proposal. What's in it for Burke?
The Berserker's gone, and the outcasts your allies.
Now, given the fact that this is also a Viking society, this sort of character development and development for a society of accepting a former enemy as an ally certainly makes more sense than Kattegat accepting Ivar back for no particular reason at all, other than Harold giving a fine speech.